Great pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Mark James. Mark's a PhD student who works at the kind of intersection of philosophy and cognitive science. And he's focuses particularly on issues to do with habit and also kind of sociality and norms. And his talk is entitled Habits and Social Experience, Being Multiply Animated, Inhabiting Ecological Entities in Embodied Interaction with Others.
Okay, thank you, James. Thanks, Elisa and Risa, for inviting me and allowing me to participate, and everybody else who give their wonderful papers over the last few days. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to rush through the earlier part of this to give us a bit more time towards the end, because I think that's where the juicy bits are. But if I'm going too fast, slow me down. So, when people interact, how does what takes place therein shape subsequent interactions between those same people? How should we describe the invariant patterns that emerge in such interactions over time? Where does the explanation for all this lie? So there are obviously some existing approaches to this, some of which have been kind of broached over the last few days. I'm not going to spend much time on those, I'm just going to jump into my own account, but they're broadly construed as, say, individualist approach, leaning on things like mental representation, or interactionalist approach, which lean more on things like practice, and we've kind of pointed out some of the deficiencies with some of those approaches over the last few days. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. We can come back to it if needs be towards the end, but I'm just going to kind of jump ahead here a little bit and say something about my approach. So I want to say my approach is not individualist, nor is it interactionalist. And it comes from what I might call a sociologically informed enactive-centric account. It doesn't privilege either domain, that's individualist nor interactionist. And the kinds of things I'm going to try and explain are patterns in social interactions that are organizationally continuous with patterns at the level of the individual. And my claim goes something along the lines that patterns are autonomously organized, autonomous in the sense that we'll get to, actually Melanie talked a little bit about it yesterday, but patterns are autonomously organized habitual entities. So as a hopefully uncontroversial starting point, what I want to say is that at both individual and interactional levels, we observe patterns at various degrees of complexity that demonstrate some invariance over time. So, now look at some examples. Right, so at the individual level, we can talk about very simple habits, something like I pick up the soap in my right hand, I'm just kind of drawn into a particular action. We can also talk about something a bit more complex, like a routine. That's a kind of concatenation of habits. Even more complex kind of invariant patterns might be something like a particular strategy or approach when I engage in a particular practice. And then something even more complex might be a kind of mode of being. So there's a tendency, as far as I'm told, for bicultural individuals to kind of adopt one or another kind of almost entire character depending on upon which language they're operating in or which cultural. And there's something invariant about that, and it's held kind of relatively consistent across time. So you can get up to something really complex, but we're not going to focus on those modes necessarily here, more kind of simple habits or routines. So I want to say there's something, say, organizational continuous between those kinds of examples at the individual level, and then examples that kind of emerge in the relationship between people. So we might talk about a simple habit as a couple having their own sides of the bed, or having a particular greeting routine that one just kind of engages with someone that they meet relatively often. Another example from some developmental literature is the idea of action arcs. So there's an example between a child and a caregiver during nappy changing, where there's a kind of build up to this activity, the activity unfolds, and then there's a kind of a fading out of the activity. And there's a relatively invariant kind of structure to this across iterations. So then there might be something more complex. So there's an example from some autoethnographic literature with two runners where if they're approaching, they've ran together for a long time, and if they're approaching, say, a dimly lit path, one sees rather poorly, so they kind of have this kind of implicit kind of assumption or relationship built into the dynamics of the interaction, where they'll just kind of swap sides, right, without even talking about it. And then after they've kind of traversed the difficult path, they'll kind of go back to the original position. And there's this kind of typifications that have emerged in the relationship. And then there's, you know, the kind of modes of being and modes of being together too, right? So Thomas Fuchs talks about falling into relationship with somebody. So there's a sense in which, you know, if I encounter somebody that I knew when I was young, for instance, and I haven't met them for a long time. Well, this is not even my phone. Actually, I meant to give that to you. I found it in the toilet, and it's belonged to someone, so actually it's a good reminder as I went home.
Okay,
So
I'll bring it to them section. I'm not stealing.
It kind of looks like I was going to steal it. That was not the plan. Okay, so falling into modes of being. Yeah, so we all kind of familiar with this, right? I act in this way with this person, and sometimes it's quite, you know, strange that I fall into a particular mode of being or something. So what I would claim, I think, is that these patterns, right, the patterns we've described, are in fact dynamically individuated, what I call ecological entities that are autonomously organized. And I'm going to approach this by first turning to some theoretical support from the science of complex adaptive systems. So complex adaptive systems is basically a kind of theoretical framework that, among other things, allows us to recognize organizational isomorphisms at multiple scales. It kind of scale invariant structure. And a complex system is basically any system exhibiting organizational unity comprised of multiple diverse connected and interdependent parts capable of adapting to changing conditions, right? So we can talk about a cell, we can talk about persons, embodied subjects, we can talk about cities, we can talk about planets. The idea is that there's something, you know, continuous about the organization of all these various entities. And complex adaptive systems is a kind of formal way to start to talk about these things. So a couple of ideas within complex adaptive systems are the notion of a self-organization and emergence, two related notions. So self-organization basically describes a characteristic of complex adaptive systems whereby local interactions between various elements following simple dynamics or rules produce complex and globally coherent structures. A couple of classic examples are the murmuration of starlings or the shoal of fish, or here what's called an ant bridge is an interesting example. One important feature of self-organization, as the name implies, is that there's no executive control, no one entity directing the action. Think of the shoal of fish, for instance. There's no fish that we can point to as leading or making the decisions. When such processes engender larger systems that have properties that their component parts do not, we speak of emergence and attribute to the emergent system a reality unto itself. Life, for instance, is an emergent property of certain types of chemical interactions. Of course, components themselves can be complex systems. The fish, for instance, can be construed as a complex system emerging from the self-organizing dynamics of its component cells. This works in the other direction too. When the fish interact with one another and comprise a shoal, the shoal can function as a component in a larger system, the ocean ecology, for instance. Such structuring is sometimes referred to as holonic. An entity is both a whole system and simultaneously part of a larger, or indeed multiple larger systems. What results is effectively kind of turtles all the way down, emergent systems within emergent systems, or what's sometimes called nested systems. And the claim that I want to make is that the patterns we have been considering are systems of a kind, right? Emergent within larger systems comprised of two or more people in recurrent interaction. So this is an active account, as I said, and an active cognitive science leans on these insights when describing mind and life. The emergence of life, goes the inactive claim, depends upon a particular self-organizing dynamic within the biochemical domain, known as autopoiesis. This graphic representation here is sometimes used to symbolize a self-producing biochemical network in reciprocal exchange with its environment. Such a network, this is the network, this is the reciprocal exchange, this is the environment. Such a network is dependent upon the self-organization of a set of co-constitutive processes, wherein one process A provides the conditions for B, which in turn provide the conditions for A, and so on. I'm going to explain that a bit more here, or a bit differently maybe. Another somewhat more abstract and, in my opinion, interesting way of understanding this self-organizing dynamic is as a dialectic between processes of self-production and processes of self-distinction. Put simply, self-production describes an effort to make oneself up from stuff available in one's environment. However, maximizing the dynamic of self-production means being totally open to all flows in the environment, a dynamic that on its own does not facilitate individuation. Being totally open to the environment is effectively to be the environment. I should just point out this is what this is symbolizing here. Right? This kind of radical openness, and this is we'll describe this one now as self-distinction. Oh, I can just point here. So self-distinction, on the other hand, entails distinguishing oneself from one's environment. But again, if this were the only operative principle, simply closing oneself off from the environment entirely would be maximally efficient. In isolation, neither dynamic is sufficient for life, for each in principle negates the other. But when played out over time, adaptively opening oneself up or closing oneself off to this or that environmental condition, this dialectic provides the basis for self-individuation of the living organism, as each dynamic provides the conditions for the other. Self-distinction provides the conditions for self-production, which in turn provides the conditions for self-distinction, and so on. This is important within an active cognitive science, for it provides at least the beginnings of a framework for understanding how the activities of minded organisms become value-laden. Activities take place against a normative backdrop enacted within the dialectical tensions of autopoiesis. In other words, the dialectic enacts a space in which certain acts are appraised as good, bad, better, or worse, to the degree to which they can maintain the dynamics of life. To use a musical analogy, we might say that the autopoietic organization is a bit like a rhythm section that provides the normative constraints for melodic improvisations, or improvisations being appraised according to the degree to which they are consonant with the groove of the rhythm section. Other theorists inspired by ideas of autopoiesis have begun asking whether norm-generating co-constitutive forms of systemic organization are operative within domains other than the biochemical, wherein such forms are not typically when they kind of make this move out of the biochemical, or even within the biochemical, but wherein such forms are not typically described as autopoietic, but more generally as autonomous. Autopoiesis, in other words, is simply one instantiation of a more general class of systemic organization talked about in terms of autonomy. So, philosophical discourse concerning autonomy normally concerns the self-governance of an individual agent by an individual agent. And this is not the sense in which it's meant here. There's obviously some relation to self-governance in this account. However, when attributing autonomy to complex systems, we're talking about self-governance with a small s and a small g. We refer not to a governing self, but to the self-governance that arises from the self-organization of a suite of co-constitutive processes that emerge under particular conditions and seek to maintain themselves as such. In other words, we say something is autonomous if it is organized according to the dialectical tension of self-production and self-distinction. So some other domains in which this has kind of been explored are behavioral, socio-interactional, even corporate and organizational. In the behavioral domain, some interesting work has been done by this guy, Xavier Brandiaran. And he actually describes habits as emerging from this kind of co-constitutive process we've been talking about. So A provides the conditions for B, which provide the conditions for A, or in the case of a habit, action gives rise to a disposition, which in turn kind of motivates an action under self-similar circumstance, which reinforces a disposition, and so on. Habits and bundles of habits are autonomous patterns in the brain-body-environment system, according to Brandy-Arn. We can look at the we can also look at the autonomy of the habit through the lens of the dialectic between plasticity, which is the operating logic of self-production, and sedimentation, which is the logic of self-distinction. Right? This is going back to this dialectic and thinking about how autonomy is manifest in the behavioral domain. Within particular conditions, I'm drawn into particular ways of acting, self-distinction, but must also remain adaptively open, self-production, to the specifics of the situation as it unfolds. I think we've been talking a lot about this morning. Moreover, how I act in certain situation, following through on a course of action, self-distinction, gives rise to a disposition to act, which also implies a kind of openness to certain types of situations, self-production. So this process of individuation in the behavioral domain are referred to as enhabiting, a process that entails relating to your environment in such a way that relational patterns stabilize and are reinforced. These relational patterns or habits I talk about as autonomous ecological entities, right? So we're kind of participating in the bringing about of these entities. The norms generated by the autopoietic organization obviously underdetermine the myriad of actions typical of a human being. We can act without our action having anything to do with the continuity of one's present biochemical organization, and indeed may even act contrary to such organization. Smoking, for instance, or skydiving have little to do with the sustenance of processes of autopoiesis. Building from some under-articulated insights in the work of Francisco Varela, Brandy-Arn develops an account of autonomous organization grounded primarily in the activity of the nervous system, but instantiated and sustained through the relationship between the actions of an individual and her environment. Here, actions derive their normative grounding not from sustaining life, as they do when motivated by autopoietic organization, but from sustaining ways of life, right? So ways of life in some sense are kind of autonomous networks inhabited in relationship and continue to kind of organize action thereafter. Returning to our musical analogy, recurring conditions distributed across the whole brain-body environment system function like a rhythm section, laying down a groove that motivates certain forms and styles of improvisation, and thereby reinforcing the likelihood that a self-similar groove will be available in the next self-similar occasion. Thus, skydiving might be contrary to the dynamics of life, in a sense. However, it might well be an action that sustains a way of life instantiated in the network of habits that motivate it. Here we return to the notion of nested systems. Habits and networks of habits can be construed as autonomous self-organizing systems nested within autonomous self-organizing systems. So another kind of domain within which autonomy is explored is the social, which Melanie talked a little bit about yesterday, or the relational domain. Here, Dieger and De Paula write, the regulated coupling between at least two agents, where the regulation is aimed at aspects of the coupling itself so that it constitutes an emergent autonomous organization in the domain of relational dynamics. Dieger and De Paula contend that a very general autonomous form of organization emerges in social interaction, building upon empirical work that recognizes a tendency for individuals in interaction to couple through their spontaneous coordination, such as the fact that people in interaction tend to become entrained, rocking and swaying in rhythm together, even actually over the phone. If you're on conversation with someone standing up, there's a tendency to entrain. They articulate how a dynamic emerges in which activities unfold in a manner that has relevance for the social system itself, often sustaining itself beyond the goals of its individual components. A familiar example of this is a conversation that neither party really desires to continue, but nevertheless it persists. I think we're all too familiar with such conversations. Autonomous dialectic in social systems. So, yeah, thinking about this again through this dialectic, right? We're just kind of making the same move over and over again. The dialectics of self-production and self-distinction pull into coordination the participants in interaction, whilst also distinguishing them from their environment. So, Marsh et al., I can't recall exactly where this came from, but it came from somewhere recently. The pull to coordinate with other individuals is fundamental, serving as the basis for our social connectedness to others. This pull, this tendency towards stability in social systems, is something which we are all familiar with as this basic urge to kind of get along, and can be seen as the basic dynamics of self-production operative in the interactive system. Simultaneously, however, interactants become sensitive to the boundaries of the interaction. Who is or is not involved, for instance. This being the dynamic of self-distinction. So, what I want to do is start to propose, well, I'll read it out here. The primary objective of my own work then, of articulating the account I speak of in terms of participatory inhabiting, is teasing out the relationship between the two domains that have just been elaborated, the behavioral and the relation. Self-organizing autonomous patterns or habits emerge within the complex adaptive system that is the individual organism and its environment. That's relatively uncontroversial, right? My claim is that the patterns that emerge within the complex adaptive system that is the relational system and its environment can also be characterized as habits in the sense articulated. We're really talking about, in both cases, nested autonomous systems. To put a finer point on it, effectively I'm saying these examples listed here. So, the couple, the having the greeting routine, the action arcs, and so on. I'm saying they can be at least described as systems within systems, as autonomous ecological entities that have emerged within recurrent interaction. So what I'm going to suggest is that autonomous patterns emerge in relational systems from a dialectic between the dynamics of self-production and self-distinction, right? So again, relying on thinking about this dialectic, thinking about how patterns emerge within interaction. I want to say that in any social interaction, the basic dynamics, as have been previously elaborated, can be described in terms of a pull into interaction and a general sensitivity to the most basic boundaries of that interaction. Who is in or who is out, right? So that's the kind of basic, the basic dialectic we talked about a minute ago. We can think about this as a basic form of systemic individuation within the relational domain. However, any such interaction also takes place within a normatively rich situation, and its success depends in part upon our sensitivities to such norms. Thus, there is another layer of individuation. The relational system must remain open to the norms of the interactive situation. Norms derived, for instance, from the behavioral setting and the institutional norms it represents, spatially and temporally proximal events, cultural and subcultural norms, and the myriad of signifiers present. Such norms function like handholds, aiding our felicitous coordinations, and being open to them is a manifestation of the dynamics of self-production. However, we must also differentiate ourselves in this normative soup. We cannot be open to every available norm. This we do through the statement, evocation, rejection, and or acceptance of particular norms, through our utterances and gestures and the myriad ways we comport ourselves. We elicit concepts, events, and narratives, and take positions with respect to them, building a picture for each other and ourselves of our positionality, all the while co-regulating our ongoing interactions. Such identifications are manifestations of the dynamics of self-distinction. In interaction, to achieve stability, we perform some subset of the norms of the socio-material environments within which we interact. With repeating interactions, there's a kind of transformation, whereby our performances sediment as the self-organizing operational dynamics of the relational system itself. the situational norms to which we have mutually assented become implicit to the relational system. This happens when the distinctions we draw take on a co-constitutive relationship with the basic pull to coordinate. Position taking and regulation of system stabilities come to co-constitute each other. The dynamic that manifests as a pull to coordinate has a hand in the pictures we paint for ourselves and each other. Think of it like this. This is kind of maybe the most important thing I'm going to say. When interactions become recurrent, we experience not just a pull to coordinate, but a pull into normatively infused patterns that facilitate coordination. Patterns infused with the outcomes of co-regulatory processes from previous interactions. In this way, recurrent social interactions engender autonomous patterns and are thereafter constrained by them. They, in other words, inhabit ecological entities that shape our ways of being together, serving as the invisible backgrounds that frame our ongoing improvisations. So let me give you an example that illustrates how this pull to coordinate becomes kind of normatively infused. I work from a shared office, which is positioned down a long hall, on the other side of which there's another shared office. Between our office spaces, we have a kitchen area with a kettle, a toaster, and a microwave. Recently, the microwave stopped working, and on the day that it did, I met a particular guy from across the hall for the first time. Both of us realizing for the first time that the microwave was no longer functional. Despite this being a terrible situation for heating food, it was a wonderful situation for an initial encounter. There's nothing that makes for a happy social interaction quite like an object of mutual contempt. Acting according to the norms invoked by the broken microwave made for a highly stable relational system. The problem now is that 5 or 6 times we've met since, our whole relationship is constructed around the saga of the broken microwave. We are drawn into it. It has power over us. We are even anxious, it seems, to reach beyond it. The stabilizing norms supplied by the situation were just so helpful to the initial interaction that the self-organizing dynamics undergirding our ongoing interactions all radiate from a microwave-infused center. Neither of us, I'm presuming, care all that much about microwaves. Although he's a computer scientist, so the possibilities there. But we do, like everybody else, care deeply about establishing stable interactions and getting along with others, particularly those we consider to be our peers. Thus, there's a kind of trade-off. Act according to situational, institutional, tribal norms, etc., in exchange for felicitous interactions. Become a conduit for particular ways of life in exchange for membership in a community that supplies stable interactions. So in closing, I want to very briefly talk about this notion of being multiply animated. Let me introduce this with a presently underdeveloped but hopefully still helpful analogy. The analogy is between what I talk about as participatory inhabiting and the activities of trophallaxis as they unfold in the world of ants. So trying to understand individual human action without understanding participatory inhabiting, I want to claim, is a bit like trying to understand the behavior of an individual ant without any understanding of trophallaxis. During trophallaxis, ants exchange various bodily fluids and in so doing engender an emergent awareness about the colony as a whole and their place within it, including the kinds of actions expected of them, who is or is not part of the colony, the boundaries of the colony, and so on. One can think of the processes of trophylactic fluid distribution amongst colony members as the circulatory system that connects each member of the superorganism. Through languaging with others, and less often through the exchange of bodily fluids, we do something quite analogous. The habits, routines, strategies, and modes of being inhabited in interactions with particular groups and others facilitate the efficient circulation of norms relevant to those groups and relationships, through which expectations are learned, identities are sedimented, and boundaries are cast. However, unlike ants, we are not a one-colony species, but circulate on behalf of all kinds of groups, relationships, institutions, tribes, and so on. Through recognizing the autonomy of the ways of life we inhabit, and how they gear us into particular communities, cultures, and so on, we must acknowledge a kind of decentering of intentionality, whereby we are moved not just from our own concerns, but also from those of the ecological entities we have inhabited in participation with others, and the larger systems of which they are component parts. In other words, we come to act, at least in part, on behalf of these ways of life. Animated by such entities, we are thus polycentric beings. Like the ants, we are lived through by them, or multiple colonies, in ways that facilitate their persistence. And normally, much as we might expect from any particular ant, we are oblivious to the role our activities play in their reproduction. We are in this way multiply animated, lived through on account of our activities by entities larger than ourselves, be they relationships, institutions, ideas, cultures, groups, or tribes. Open to the norms they manifest, we produce and reproduce ourselves in their images. Closed to what exists beyond their boundaries, we produce and reproduce their boundaries in us. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark. So we now have about 15 minutes for questions.
Thanks for the talk. So I take that's from the general idea that kind of the centrality of patterns from an activism. So I think this was very interesting. So the idea that there's some kind of alternative to the dualism between individual approaches and
Right.
interactions. So once you focus on patterns, then you have different levels of individuation of patterns. So, and that this is I think it's important to understand habits also, and then to go to an ecological understanding. What I would like to understand better in the dynamic system approach is whether it really can succeed in account for normativity, in the sense that the mechanisms you have sketched of normative backdrop. Yeah? So can this really account for? So for what does it account for? So because one could say that it accounts for functional organization. So let's see, rules of functional organization, and it should be. It's less obvious that it accounts for, and maybe we could call this norms. Yeah, norms, functional norms of organization. It's less obvious that it accounts for other kinds of norms, which are what we usually discuss as social norms. So, I know, for instance, I think that you can, also Barandian does this, or some other discuss this, that you can not pretty easily step from functional norms to proscriptive norms. It's less obvious that you can, from there, construct a story about prescriptive norms. So you have, so that is norms that have the form don't do this. You can somehow from functional organization step to proscriptive norms, but more difficult, at least I've seen in the discussion in dynamic systems theory, to get from there to prescriptive norms that are what we usually understand when we talk about normativity. Yeah, so at least in the contemporary normativity jargon is basically has to do start from the philosophy with prescriptions. Yeah. So the point is this. So, can you really account for normativity, or are you just accounting for functional organization, or maybe prescriptions?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a long way to go for the enactive account if it is going to get there, right? But I think there's some sense in which what we talk about in terms of prescriptive norms are abstracted from these what have proved functional in some circumstance, right? And they facilitate the kind of stable interaction of or stable coordination to produce stable systems. And then they're kind of abstracted, reified, or whatever, and they become more prescriptive. But when they're prescriptive, right, they're still facilitating this kind of ongoing coordination. So there's always this element of achieving stable systems as kind of part of what it is to talk about normativity, right? And if they weren't, in some sense, they probably wouldn't last as prescriptive norms. I think we underestimate, what you're talking about in terms of functional norms, we underestimate just how much they organize our action, right? My unwillingness to step out of line in a given situation, for instance, I'll give an example. I think it's a funny one, but it also illustrates something powerful, I think. I was just joined UCD and was just a fledgling member of the philosophy department, and we were standing outside in the foyer one day, and there was a few senior academics there and a few senior PhDs and whatnot, and I was kind of sitting there quietly eating my lunch, and if I remember right, it was a lamb curry or something along those lines. And I took a piece of lamb and I was trying to chew on this piece of lamb, and I didn't obviously chew it right, and I went into a state of I'm actually choking, right? And I was so concerned with the kind of the stability of the system that was present at the time, right? And the people who were in it and the norms that were just implicit because of their presence, that I actually said to myself, I'm going to let somebody else pick me off the floor because I'm not going to make a scene here. I was like, I'm not going to kind of be the one that does that and then be kind of left with that, right? And that's just this kind of functional stability that we're talking about. There was, I knew everybody there was going to be receptive if I did say, look, I'm choking, somebody help me. Nobody's going to, it's not like I had the sense of these people aren't, capable of helping me in that situation. It was just that at least from my sense, there's already this kind of ongoing effort all the time to kind of vector towards these kind of stable interactions, and built into that kind of vectoring becomes a kind of normatively infused or something along those lines. Now, I agree with you, there's a long, long way to go, right? But I think it's an interesting starting point.
Yeah, it's interesting. The only point was that, even prescriptive rules can play a prescriptive function. The point is whether whether prescriptive rules come out from prescriptive ones. So if this story, can you deduce, not deduce, but reconstruct the genesis of prescriptions out of prescriptions? This is what the question. So because it's a different one from whether prescriptions still play a prescriptive function. So.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if I have a good answer for you.
Any other questions?
Just a comment, actually. Thanks so much. I was actually puzzled because if you could, swap the terminology, I was going more or less in the same direction as you, and maybe if I understood you correctly. Just out of curiosity, the example of the out-of-order microwave, and how it generates an opportunity for social interaction and for sedimentation of experiences. Wherever it's symptomatic, that's an example where something breaks down, and so was wondering, would you agree that in that situation, an habitual pattern of behavior may rise out of a rupture, to quote from Felix, from Felix' talk from yesterday, out of the rupture of a continuity.
Right.
And so, how do we get those ruptures, though? Because there is a continuity in your, general picture. So.
Yeah. So I think the breakdown there, though, is not in the interaction itself, right? It's in so there's this normatively arranged environment for either of us individually, right? And we come upon the microwave, and there's a rupture, kind of at the level of me wanting to use the microwave, right? And there's a rupture for him, but that opens up this kind of new normative space where all of a sudden we have this shared common ground, right? A working microwave is not so much of a common ground as a broken microwave and all the things that entails, right? Because straight away you can start to, the school needs to look after us a bit better, or so many things kind of just emerge given that circumstance, right? So the rupture is there. I don't think the rupture is in the interaction itself, but the rupture in the normal unfolding of the normative action. Actually, in that instance, it's a good point, but it supplies the kind of normative constraints going forward or something. But I'm very interested in those ideas. I mean, like I was just describing there about awkwardness, because they definitely they seem to tell us something about how these things are organized in the first place, right? So if I experience dissonance with respect to some activity I have or do or make or participate in or whatever, there's some sense in which I experience that as something that I don't want, right? That almost like a hunger is to be gotten rid of. And there's very often this sense of how I can get rid of it too, right? So in the case of awkwardness, if I say something, out of place or something, I'll make effort to kind of, I don't know, console someone or do whatever it is that's going to try and return the stability. And for my money, there's something about that says something about what's ongoing, what's part of the background and kind of guiding us towards particular types of interactions in the first place. The fact that they're not normally awkward, right, says something about how they're being constrained by certain dynamics or something along that lines. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.